Hi, I'm Tim Naftali. I'm director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. It's November 12th, 2011. We are in Tucson, Arizona, and I have the honor and privilege to be interviewing Henry Ruth for the Richard Nixon Oral History Program. Mr. Ruth, thank you for doing this. Just to give people a sense of your background before we talk about the Watergate investigation, please tell us a little bit about the Civil Rights Division in Mississippi, where you were in 1964.
Well, I had just come from the organized crime section in the Department of Justice, and I was recruited to go to Mississippi in the summer of '64 and went down there probably in June. And our instructions really were to team up with another justice person and go from town to town in Mississippi and locate who was the power structure in the black and white communities and go visit with them and persuade them that if they did not keep the peace during that summer, the federal troops may have to come back.
Were you there when the 3 civil rights workers disappeared?
I arrived just after they had disappeared.
Did you meet John Doar at this point?
I had met John Doar in Brooklyn. He was actually a neighbor in our backyard. He had the house across the alley from us in Brooklyn.
Oh, when? When was that?
Well, I worked for Mayor Lindsay in New York,
Oh.
and I think John was just a lawyer in New York then.
When you were, well, we'll talk about your experience with Mayor Lindsay in a moment. When you were with the Civil Rights Division, do you remember meeting Dorothy Landsberg?
She was a paralegal, I believe.
Yes.
I didn't meet Dorothy until I went with a law firm later on in Washington, and she was an employee there.
Or did you meet Bob Owens when you were in?
Yes. He wasn't happy that we were down there.
Why?
Well, he was investigating the disappearance of the people, and John Doar had asked me to meet with Bob and talk about what they were doing in the grand jury investigation.
Tell us a little bit about what you did as deputy director for LBJ's Crime Commission.
Well, Johnson really appointed I should say in the Deputy Attorney General's office, Nick Katzenbach had asked us to put together plans for a National Crime Commission and a Crime Commission for the District of Columbia. And Nick brought in Jim Vornberg from Harvard to work on that plan. So I worked for Vornberg in the Deputy Attorney General's office, and 4 of us put together a plan. It's remarkable how little knowledge there was at that time anywhere about crime. There were practically no statistics, and we went back to the Wickersham Commission that Herbert Hoover had run in the early 30s and read their report, and there practically had been no change since then generally in criminal justice. Certainly there had been big changes in the federal system, but the local system was remarkably ad hoc.
Even with the FBI's training of local, state, police forces?
Well, they really trained, not many compared to the thousands of local officers that there were.
Leon Jaworski was on the commission.
Yes,
Is this where you met him? For the first time?
I believe so. And every time Leon would leave a meeting of the Crime Commission, he would say, "I'll be over at 1600, which meant the White House. So he was obviously pretty well connected.
Before we move to your legal, your career as a law professor, tell us, what did you do for the Organized Crime Division before you went to Mississippi for the Civil Rights Division?
Well, at that time, the members of the Organized Crime Section were each assigned to a particular area. And when I first got to justice, I think it was October of '61, the head of the section was Bill Hundley, who's now deceased, and the head of the criminal division was Jack Miller, who later was Mr. Nixon's private attorney, and who was really my first boss in the Justice Department. And I was sent to New York to help Hundley try a rather monumental case against Judge Keogh, who was a congressman, brother of Congressman Keogh, of Keogh plans, and Tony Duxcarello, who was an organized crime figure, and the first assistant DA in Brooklyn. I'm sorry, the first assistant U.S. attorney, Elliot Kahaner. So we tried that case for a number of weeks, and the jury was out a long time and came back finally with guilty verdicts.
Tell us a little bit. What was it like to work for Attorney General Robert Kennedy?
Well, for me at the time, it was thrilling because I'd read a lot about Kennedy, and Bill Hundley had worked for Kennedy on the Hill and knew Kennedy's very well. And Robert Kennedy met periodically with the entire organized crime section, and each of us would report what was going on in the areas that we were working and what problems we were having.
So you actually got to interact with the Attorney General.
Oh, yes.
Can you give us a word picture of what he was like?
He was a very intense young man and very knowledgeable. And if we would raise a problem with the local United States attorney in the district or a problem with any of the federal agencies, Kennedy would get on the phone immediately during the meeting with the agency or the U.S. attorney and tell them basically to shape up and start full cooperation.
When did you begin to teach law?
I taught at Penn Law School from 1967 to 69, I believe.
And what was your specialty?
Well, I taught criminal law and evidence and juvenile court processing.
How did you come to work for Mayor Lindsay?
Well, as usually happened, I changed jobs a lot during the time I was working, and changes usually came up because I got a phone call, and there was a Vera Institute of Justice in New York City run by a fellow named Herb Stirs, and they had done some of the original criminal justice research. And Lindsay was looking for somebody to head his Criminal Justice Coordinating Council in New York. And Stairs recommended me to Lindsay, and his office called. I went up and had an interview.
And please give us a word picture of John Lindsay.
Well, I could see as soon as I saw him why he was a magnetic political personality. And when I was working for him, the people that basically did the hustling for him would go out in the neighborhoods and just make it known that Lindsay was coming that day at a certain hour. And just thousands of people would always turn up. And they loved him, except in certain areas of Brooklyn and where he had really integrated public housing, and some of the longtime residents did not appreciate that.
And just so that the viewers who might not be familiar with Mr. Lindsay, Mr. Lindsay was a Republican.
Yes, in name. I never viewed him as a Republican. Once I knew his views, he really was a liberal person in terms of having a fully integrated community and giving everybody a chance for every job.
How did you come to be named as deputy to Archibald Cox?
Well, since I had worked with Jim Vornberg in the Deputy Attorney General's office, Jim was on the faculty at Harvard Law School, and of course Archie Cox was from Harvard Law School, and Jim was doing a lot of recruiting, and Archie needed a deputy, and they wanted a Republican, because they were being accused already of being a Democrat's office. And I don't know whether Jim told Archie I was a Republican or what, but anyway, I was invited down to Washington and interviewed with Cox. I had interviewed him previously at the actually before I originally joined Justice, when Archie was Solicitor General, and I applied for the Solicitor General's office, and he rejected me. I wasn't from Harvard. And I don't think Archie remembered that interview when I saw him in connection with Watergate.
So they hired you, assuming that you were a Republican.
I think Archie, that may be one reason I was interviewed, because I thought I was. I don't know how. I mean, excuse me, I'd never been political or anything.
Tell us, please, this so that the viewers know. I believe we're talking about May of 1973. What were you doing at that point?
I was working in New York for John Lindsay.
Still working for the mayor. How did anyone have a sense of how big the office would become, the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, when these interviews occurred?
Well, they had a tentative plan at that time for 5 task forces, which basically meant people that would investigate in 5 separate areas. And I think they had a sense of how big it was going to be, because they had to put a budget together. And so I think the goal was 38 to 40 lawyers.
What were your tasks going to be as the deputy?
Well, Cox said he wanted to work on primarily himself on the Watergate cover-up, and I was to supervise everything else. And that's what I did.
Did you recruit any of the people that came?
Yeah, before I left New York, I interviewed a number of people from the Southern District of New York, U.S. Attorney, who were recommended to me by people I'd gotten to know in New York as really good prosecutors. And so I interviewed Benveniste, and there were 2 or 3 other lawyers that we hired from that office eventually. I interviewed Rudy Giuliani, but I don't think he was interested. He wanted to become the head of narcotics in New York, the office.
Please tell us a little bit. I'm going to go through the, you've just mentioned Mr. Benveniste. I'm going to go through and mention each of the senior staff, and just if you would give us a word picture of them. And well, we'll start with Richard Benveniste.
Rick was sort of the prototype of what you get to know as a young federal prosecutor. And that is a person who's brilliant, arrogant, sure of himself, and fun to be with.
Thomas McBride.
McBride I had gotten to know in the Justice Department. And Tom was a real veteran and had been a prosecutor for a long time with the federal government.
Richard Davis.
Davis was one of the folks I interviewed from the Southern District, and he was really, I think, the most brilliant young lawyer we had. And so he was hired immediately.
Joe Connolly.
Joe Connolly was from Philadelphia. I don't think Joe had done criminal law previously. And so he was relatively inexperienced and certainly had no experience working in the environment that we were in Washington, where the news media reviewed our work every night.
Would that cause him some trouble?
Well, yeah. I mean, there was a time the Washington Post was buying our trash, and proud of it, I must say, and published some internal memos at the time, at the very beginning of some of the investigations. So we hadn't been around long enough to really dispose of trash by shredding it. So that was just a problem temporarily.
William Merrill.
Merrill was a experienced federal prosecutor from Detroit, I believe. And he was a Democrat, I remember, with a lot of experience as a federal prosecutor.
Tell us about, I know it's a long time ago, but I had a chance to interview for the library Earl Silbert. Tell us, what was the state of the case when you come in May of 1973? How far along was the investigation that you were picking up?
Well, I should mention that Henry Peterson, in the criminal division of the Department of Justice, he was deputy in the organized crime section, and I had become a very close friend of his. and disqualified myself and Watergate from their investigation of him for his participation in the early investigation of Watergate by Sobert. And Henry told me before I got there the status of the investigation and where he thought it might go. And they were pursuing John Dean, and I think they had, of course, convicted the Watergate burglars. And the Watergate burglars were making noises that led Sobert to believe that one or more of them might want to cooperate with the government. And so I thought Sobert had proceeded somewhat effectively, and many in the office thought he had not. But I think as people look back, you'd say he was doing what he could at the time. It was not a comfortable position for a career federal prosecutor to be suspecting the President of the United States of committing a crime.
What do you think Did Henry Peterson later talk to you afterwards about why he played the role he played and why he let John Dean sit in on these negotiations, why he kept the White House informed of the progress of the negotiations, of the investigations as it did?
Well, if you look back to the time, it was a time when basically people still had confidence in their president. And Henry Peterson was an old-fashioned Roman Catholic traditional guy. He could not believe that his president would have committed a crime in office, which is not to say he wouldn't pursue it, but at the time he couldn't believe that Mr. Nixon would have committed the acts that were being suggested. And I remember when Bork in the White House tried to abolish our office, Peterson was very cooperative with us. And I think part of the reason was that he and I were old friends, and he knew that I could rely on him. And I had told Benveniste that in their investigation of Peterson, I would disqualify myself. And in fact, if they ever indicted Henry, I would probably be a character witness for him.
The White House criticized Archibald Cox for expanding the mandate, his mandate. In our interviews with Mr. Ruggles House, he at the time he was he had been the acting director of the FBI, and then of course he comes into the Justice Department. He says that whenever the Justice Department asked Cox to restrict his investigation, that Cox did. Can you recall discussions with the Justice Department over the breadth of the mandate of the WSPF in that period?
Well, I think probably for the first 6 months of our office, those were somewhat continuing because new things kept arising, and Ruggles House would always oppose our investigation. And I never thought that any of their objections had substance because I didn't want to pursue anything that wasn't part of our mandate. but it was a pretty broad mandate.
Within a month of, or roughly a month of your starting, John Dean testifies. How does that change your investigation? How does his testimony before the Senate change your investigation?
Well, Dean was under investigation as a key person. And in fact, he pleaded guilty on October 19, the day before the Saturday Night Massacre. And before he pleaded guilty, the officers had extensive interviews with him to see what his cooperation would produce. So informally, Dean had already told us a lot of what he testified to in the Senate. Nobody, of course, had mentioned the tapes by then. And so we had an idea that Dean was key. Dean was represented by, I think his name was Charlie Schaffer, who had been attorney for one of the government cooperating witnesses in the Keogh case. So I knew Schaffer, and a number of people in the office knew Schaffer. And it was just a question of trusting whether, if we took a plea of guilty from Dean with an offer of cooperation, we had to be sure that the cooperation was important and truthful.
And how did you determine, how did you assess that?
Well, like you always do as a prosecutor, you match what a witness is proposing to say with what you know from other people. And Dean had I think, the best memory of any witness I've ever seen. He could literally remember every conversation years later. It was absolutely remarkable. And he'd do that without notes. Like if you ask Dean about this interview 20 years from now, he would remember that you were sitting at a table and I was in a chair and where the cameras and lights were. He was just an amazing memory.
So you met Mr. Dean then before he testified before the Senate?
Yeah.
Was he seeking immunity from the Watergate Special Prosecution Force?
I'm sure he had originally, but his lawyer knew that was impossible.
How did Alexander Butterfield's revelation of the taping system change your work?
Well, it changed it enormously because the White House had been accusing us of being Democrats and liars and Nixon haters. And we were convinced that the tapes would show that John Dean was telling the truth. And so tapes are crucial to an investigation. In fact, ever since Watergate, every juror probably that's ever been sworn in any case, is where are the tapes? Prosecutors have told me that that's a real problem. Jurors always want the tapes. And of course, usually there aren't tapes. But Butterfield, I think, caught everybody by surprise. And of course, our immediate reaction is, how do we get them? And we expected and received resistance from the White House the whole time I was there.
How did you go about selecting the first 9 tapes to subpoena? Because the very first subpoena in July of '73 is just for 9 tapes. How did you select those? What do you recall of that?
Well, the people doing the investigation just took the testimony they already had, and they knew from that where certain things might have occurred. I mean, on the key tape, I think it was June 21st, the Haldeman tape, the 18.5-minute gap.
June 20th.
June 20, yeah. People knew, we knew ahead of time that June 20 obviously was a key date, and that if Haldeman was having a discussion with the president, they were probably discussing shutting down the CIA's participation with us, shutting down the FBI, and trying to prevent our tracing the money.
Did you at that point have access to Haldeman's notes?
No, we didn't have access to anything at that point.
When did the White House start to give you some documents?
I really don't remember initially, but I don't think it was till after we had litigated everything about the tapes.
As you said, the tapes become a major point of contention between the Watergate Special Prosecution Force and the White House. What do you recall of the evolution of the Stennis Compromise in the fall of 1973, which of course would lead to the Saturday Night Massacre?
Well, what was the nature of that compromise?
That Senator Stennis would listen to the tapes, would actually that the White House would provide transcripts of the subpoenaed tapes, that the Senator John Stennis of Mississippi would listen to the tapes and corroborate the validity of the actually summaries. It wasn't even clear that there would be transcripts; there would be summaries, and that those would be handed over to you.
I must say I was always impatient about Archie's discussions with Richardson about access to the tapes. Archie was an old friend of Elliot Richardson up in Massachusetts, and they were big Boston Brahmins and trusted each other. Archie thought Richardson was acting in good faith. I did not. And to me, it was so obvious as a prosecutor that once Dean had testified, and there were obviously tapes of the conversations that Dean testified to, that we had to have them in order to bring a criminal case. You couldn't put on a criminal case after that, put John Dean on the stand, and have the defense point out where are the tapes. Is Dean a liar? The tapes would show whether Dean was a liar or not. You don't have the tapes. So I got impatient with these continuous meetings and arguments because I thought if Archie didn't know how crucial tapes were, Richardson certainly did as a former prosecutor.
Why did you not think that Elliot Richardson, the Attorney General, was acting in good faith?
Well, I sat in on a lot of Archie Richardson conversations, and Richardson would keep arguing we don't need them. And for the reasons I just pointed out, we obviously did need them. There was no way to go ahead without them.
Help the researcher, future researcher, understand this. He said, we don't need them because we can prosecute this case without them, or we don't need them because they're irrelevant?
Well, I don't know if Elliot believed there was a case. I don't know how much he knew at the time. But he did say, we don't need them. And he was sincerely arguing that even though the president and Dean were talking, as Dean had already testified, about criminal acts, executive privilege applied. I never understood that argument.
Elliot Richardson argued that executive privilege applied.
That was his main reason, yeah.
And he also said we don't need them.
Yes.
Mr. Ruggles House has told us that because of his experience with the FBI, he knew that there was a case, and that this was what governed his behavior during the Saturday Night Massacre, because he did not want to be held responsible for obstruction of justice. Did you interact with Mr. Ruggles House at that point too on this question of the Stennis compromise?
No, he really didn't surface until that Saturday night.
Should I interpret what you're saying also to mean that Archibald Cox didn't fully understand the importance of the tapes? In your mind?
I don't think originally he did. The importance he understood, the key nature to a prosecution. I think you have to have experience as a prosecutor to really appreciate that.
Please tell us, since most of the people watching someday will not have that experience, what is the difference between the actual tape and a summary of its content in a court of law?
Well, under the Senate compromise, the summary would have been done by somebody else. And when a court is offered evidence in which there is stricter proof of what that evidence really is, the court would ask for the stricter proof. I don't think a court would accept the summary knowing the tapes actually exist.
At what point did you conclude that Archibald Cox was not going to accept the compromise that Attorney General Richardson and the White House had worked out?
Well, I don't think I ever concluded that. They were still arguing on the day that Archie was fired.
Oh, but wasn't his press conference that morning, or that afternoon, I mean, wasn't that press conference his way of saying, I don't accept this compromise?
Yes. That was the morning he was fired. In fact, during that, when Archie went on national television that morning, Saturday morning, and press was all around, and I gathered the task force leaders in the back of the room. And at that point, we were convinced Archie was going to be fired. And I asked I was deputy, and I knew I would, for the moment at least, succeed. Archie, I called the task force leaders to the back of the room and asked them all to stay, even after Archie had been fired, that we had a duty to finish the job. And they all agreed.
Did Elliot Richardson, during these negotiations that you witnessed with Professor Cox, did he make it clear that he was getting pressure from the White House? The White House actually wanted to fire Cox, and that he and others were trying to find a compromise to avoid a constitutional crisis. Did he ever make that argument in talking to Archie Cox?
Well, I don't know if I'm in a position to know that. Archie never told us. And as I said, they were such good friends that if Elliot asked him to keep something in confidence for the moment, I think Archie would have.
So when on that morning, October 20th, when Archibald Cox goes before the cameras and the nation, he hasn't yet been fired, but you know that you're anticipating that the outcome of this press conference is that he would be fired.
We were all certain of that.
Including Archibald Cox.
He wouldn't say at a time.
So you weren't close enough to him at that point for him, or just help us understand him. There were certain things he wouldn't share with you?
I think issues about his relationship with Richardson, because he knew how I felt, because I would meet with Archie a lot alone and tell him, we need those tapes. There's no way to argue that planning a crime is a matter of executive privilege. Presidents aren't allowed to plan crimes and say that that's key to future conversations.
Given your assumption, then, you were then assuming that Elliot Richardson would indeed fire his friend, Archibald Cox.
Yeah. No, I think we thought the White House would. Because he was talking as well with, what was the lawyer's name in the White House from Texas?
Fred Bazard?
No, the fellow from Texas.
Charlie Wright?
Yes. Charlie Wright was belligerent.
Tell us, please, what you remember of that afternoon and that evening of October 20th.
Well, we were all quite pleased with Archie's press conference because he had done that so skillfully to tell the nation why you are pursuing a president when the president says, don't pursue me. It was pretty gutsy for a professor, which Archie was, and to be convincing that this was the correct reason to press on and that he should press on. And, well, you were a professor. I don't know if you know many professors that could have run a press conference that skillfully. And we all went home that afternoon expecting the worst. And Archie expected the worst. And he said, he told me he'd call me as soon as he heard anything. So I went home that night and did not eat dinner. Probably had a couple drinks. We were all exhausted. And Archie called early evening and said, the White House has fired me and there's a messenger on the way to my house. So I haven't seen any document yet. So I didn't want to rush in and take over ahead of time. So Archie said, I'll call when the letter gets here. And he called a couple times to say the motorcycle guy was lost. So he finally called me, I think it was close to 8 in the evening, and told me he'd gotten the letter and that I better go in and take charge. he didn't tell me to go in. He said, because it was a Saturday night, he said, I guess you're the boss. So I called Carl Feldbaum, my assistant, and told him to get into the office as soon as he could. And the news reports were that the FBI had seized our office under the direction of Colonel Haig. So I said, Carl, get in there. And he and I had interviewed a few people about a key matter. And the person had provided us with tapes of some of his conversations. And I said, get in there and get those tapes out of there before the FBI goes through our files. So Carl went in there. And after Archie had said he received the letter, I went into the office. And the FBI was at the entrance and said, nothing goes in, nothing goes out. I said, well, can I bring a couple up letters from my wife out? And they said no. And one of the agents was a fellow we'd been working with since day one, and he was sent by Haig, or I guess by the FBI as one of the group to seize our office. And I asked him, whose side are you on, you know? And he said, I'm on your side. And we had subpoenaed, I think, Haldeman into the grand jury the following Tuesday. And I said to the agent, Haldeman's coming into the grand jury next Tuesday. And he said, well, bring him in. And I was very concerned at that point that one of the office guys was going to slug an agent. We had guards from our office, from the
Marshal's service, maybe?
yeah, and the FBI wasn't treating him that well. And when I went in, there was a staff member, Phil Bakes, was on the staff. And Phil was about to get into a fight with one of the agents, and I said, cool it. And I eventually called the staff together that night because everybody had come in. And we were getting telegrams from all over, all over the country.
Would you like to take some water?
Yeah.
We'll just stop for a minute for coffee.
Let me take a pause out and change some batteries.
Okay, you
About
want to
30
stop
seconds.
the tape for a second? Thanks. When you're ready, are we rolling? Thank you. Mr. Ruth, did you get those tapes out that night?
Yes. Carl, my assistant, Carl Feldbaum, was in there and his wife was with him. And she took them out in her underwear. We had taken documents out of the office for the full week prior to the massacre because we sensed what was coming, and we thought that people might seize and destroy our evidence.
Did Professor Cox know you were doing this?
I really don't know.
I'll put it this way, you didn't talk to him about this.
No.
So this was something that you were talking with the other senior staff about.
Yeah, everybody was planning how to do that. And so we took them to different places. I took some to a safe deposit box in Center City.
By the way, do you recall stopping any investigations during the period when Professor Cox was there because Mr. Ruggles House and the Justice Department had asked you to stop an investigation?
No.
Tell us, please, who you met downstairs in the lobby that night.
Well, when I had met with the staff, and then Jim Doyle, our press guy, made me meet with the press. And at that press conference, whatever I said, I know the White House was very upset because Peterson had told me that the White House had told him to fire me after that night. And but when I left the office, I got down to the lobby and it was empty except for Ralph Nader standing there. And I was about at the point in that evening not to be very patient. So I said to him, "What the hell are you doing here?" And he mumbled something. I said, "Well, get the hell out. We don't want you upstairs. You have nothing to do with this." And he put his head down and left.
Was the FBI officer that you remember working with, was that Angelo Lano?
Yes. Angie. Have you interviewed him?
Yes.
Oh, great. Well, I'm sure he remembers that night.
Yeah, yes, he does. and how badly he felt about what happened.
Well, you couldn't tell he felt badly that night.
Did you ever talk to him about it later?
Yes. Yeah, I'm a great admirer of Lano. He was a good investigator.
Tell it now. The White House doesn't disestablish. Are you disestablished as a force that night? Watergate Special Prosecutor. Are you put out of business?
Well, Bork thought we were, and the White House said we were, but nobody signed any document abolishing us, and we had been established by federal regulation. And by law, you can't repeal a federal regulation without a written order.
Did you later think that this was just an oversight that night?
I just thought it was a matter of the usual incompetence of the White House people.
When do you see Solicitor General Bork for the first time after this, now acting Attorney General Bork after this event?
Well, it was either the next day or a day later, because he fired Archie and then immediately left and went home. So I didn't talk to him that night. I was able to reach Henry Peterson that night. Henry was down at a weekend home he had at Chesapeake Bay. And Henry told me that he had talked to Bork, and Bork was taken aback by all the fuss, because we were getting, Western Union said later, we got a record number of telegrams ever sent in one time to Washington, D.C. We got thousands of telegrams saying, stay in there.
Did Mr. Peterson understand the gravity of the situation when you spoke to him that night?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he said, these guys are crazy. And I've been told that you'll report to the criminal division starting tomorrow. And so, and he said that Bork had reacted alarmingly to the reaction that night to the firing. I don't know if you remember that night, but television was just all over it. And I think that very night we had 10 senators and congressmen tell us they would introduce impeachment resolutions the next day, the next business day. So it was pretty clear that the reaction to what Nixon had done and Bork had done was going to be impeachment proceedings.
Do you go into work the next day?
Sure,
Well, it's a Sunday, actually.
we all went to work.
Who was the head of the criminal division that you were supposed to be reporting to?
Well, Peterson was.
So you were working for Peterson now, technically.
Well, I had told the office when I met with him that night that I wasn't going to assume we were abolished and that we would continue answering the phone, Watergate Special Prosecution Force. We'd use our stationery, and that I would talk to Judge Sirica, make sure that our grand jury would not be disturbed.
And what did Mr. Peterson say to that?
Go ahead.
Tell us, please, what you remember of the day that that Solicitor General Bork, now acting Attorney General Bork, comes before the staff and tries to explain himself.
Well, I had him meet with at first the task force heads and other key people to ask any questions they wanted to. And the first question, of course, to Bork, why did you fire Archie? And we had absolutely no conception that Bork knew what he was doing. And I regarded it initially as an obstruction of justice, because you don't fire a prosecutor when he's in the middle of an investigation of the President of the United States. And Bork gave some reasons which were irrelevant to us. And he finally said that we would not be fired, we would stay around, and that they would appoint another special prosecutor, which we had no faith in. Who would be their choice? Of course. So the meeting, I thought, was not a good meeting. And later that day or the next day, we met with Peterson, which the staff regarded as a good meeting, when we talked about what each task force was doing and where they were. And we asked them, will you sign more requests to the White House for documents and more requests to the White House for tapes? And Henry said, sure. I'm not sure he knew what Bork would do, but we just went on and got back to work the next Monday morning.
Please tell us your reaction when you heard that Leon Jaworski would be the new special prosecutor.
Well, I was in a wait-and-see mood. I mean, I liked Leon when he was on the commission, and I knew he was a well-connected man, but I was worried that he might have just too much respect for the presidency to really investigate such a person. So when Leon got to Washington the first time, I asked our press guys to go out to Dulles and meet him at the airport. Bring him in. And I had the whole staff assembled and brought him in to meet the staff. It was not a great meeting. Jaworski was idolized at his law firm in Texas. And we were told to call him Colonel. And of course, none of our guys wanted to do that. Leon never told us to do that, but I forget who told us that this is the way you get to know Jaworski and win his respect. So he had to get to know the people in the office and be briefed on everything we were doing before he said, "You guys are close, aren't you?" He started to believe right away that we were doing legitimate investigations and that the president legitimately was a target.
Do you remember the dinner that Leon Jaworski had with Cox before Cox went to Harvard? I think you were at that dinner with Lacovara, Mr. Lacovara.
I don't remember anything about it. Did something occur there?
It was just an opportunity for Archibald Cox to give some advice to Leon Jaworski. And Jaworski talks about that dinner in his memoirs and mentions that you were there. I just wondered if you remembered that. Please tell us about your reaction and the staff's reaction when the very first tapes start to come over from the White House, because the White House responds to the public reaction following the Saturday Night Massacre by changing its position on the 9 subpoenaed tapes.
Yeah, the massacre was Saturday night, and we were in court Tuesday morning when the president got up and said, "This president does not defy the law, will make the tapes available," which I think really pleased Judge Sirica. We had had many discussions what to do if Nixon continued to disobey the court and not turn over the tapes. Because what one usually does is ask the court that is being disobeyed to hold the person in contempt. So the issue was whether we should ask Sirica to hold Nixon in contempt if they continued with a position of non-compliance. And there were great debates about what that means if a president was held in contempt of court. Because sometimes a witness held in contempt of court is confined in jail under the condition that he stay there until he complies with a court order. None of us thought that was appropriate for the president. So we hadn't really decided what to do that day if the president's lawyer got up and said, "We won't turn over the tapes." And I don't think Judge Sirica knew what he was going to do either. So when he decided to turn over the tapes, Phil Lacovara wanted to resign from the office. When I met with the staff that Saturday night, I said, "I don't want anybody to leave the office. I really want every single person to remain and to be at work the next business day." And I sent Carl Feldbaum, my assistant, and Richie Davis, one of the attorneys, to keep in touch with everybody and make sure no one was going to resign. I thought that was very important, that the office stay together. And when Lacavera said he was going to resign, he had to be persuaded not to. He thought, I think, that this was part of the White House strategy to fire Cox and we would go away, and that if we stayed, nothing would happen in the way of cooperation. So it was dangerous for us to stay, Phil thought. Number was finally convinced him otherwise, and he did stay, although he did resign at some point, but later.
Well, he would participate in the big Supreme Court case.
Yeah.
So what was your reaction when you learned that some of the tapes didn't exist that had been subpoenaed, and that one of the ones that did exist had an 18.5-minute gap?
Well, of course, we were surprised because the Secret Service had assured us, that they'd kept the tapes secure. We had I think, as I recall, very funny conversations with Len Garment and Fred Vizart about missing tapes. And at one point, Garment said to us, well, we're going to resign, and Nixon will have to get legal aid. Well, we said we'd be happy to talk to the legal aid lawyers. But Vizart, I think, I don't know what he really believed in. General Haig would keep telling us that there was nothing damaging in any of the tapes, which, of course, at that point, we sensed was definitely not true.
Well, he would say that he never listened to them, actually.
I don't know if he did or not.
What would you say? How would you describe the relationship between Jaworski and Colonel Haig?
Well, I think Haig made the crucial mistake in our office, and maybe to the whole investigation, because up to one meeting we had with Haig, I think Jaworski was not totally convinced that Nixon had done these things. And I remember we went over one day, Leon and I, to meet with Haig about access to the tapes. And it was snowing. And we told Haig a time certain we'd be at the White House gate, and he said, come on over. So we went over, and Haig kept us standing in the snow for about 20 minutes. And as each minute went by, I could see Leon's temperature going up. And by the time Haig admitted us, Leon was absolutely furious. And I don't think Haig realized how crucial that was. But after that meeting, Leon talked entirely differently.
In his memoirs, Mr. Jaworski talks about listening to the tapes as a turning point in his assessment of the case.
Yes, very much so.
Can you recall when you and he listened to those tapes for the first time?
Yeah. Well, when we finally got the tapes, we appointed my assistant, Carl Feldbaum, to really be in charge of handling them, making sure they were kept secure in our office, and that only people authorized would ever hear any of them. So when we finally got them one day, I said to Carl, we'll go listen. And listen to June 21. And so he took them into his office, and I think he and Benveniste were the first to listen to them. And have you listened to that tape?
The June 20th?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It's a remarkable tape. When the president says, well, I can get $1 million.
Oh, you mean the March 21st, the cancer on the presidency conversation with John Dean.
Yeah.
March 21st, 1973, yes. It's very clear. It's an Oval Office conversation.
Yes. And Dean is told by the President of the United States, I can get $1 million if the Watergate defendants need that to keep quiet. And Carl came in and told me that was on that tape. I said, well, let's play it for Leon. So we took it into Leon. And as he listened to it, I would watch him, and his head would go down a little more. Each time Nixon would indicate that he was willing to pay off these guys, and slowly his head started to shake. And when I spoke to him afterwards, he said, I can't believe that a president of the United States actually said that. And I said, well, we all believe it, and it's time that you believe it, because there it is on tape.
When did you begin to suspect that the president was involved in the cover-up?
Oh, as soon as I got there and talked to Henry Peterson, it was plain to me that Nixon had done things he shouldn't have done. I didn't know whether they were crimes at the time, but
So Peterson told you this?
yeah. Well, as Peterson had slowly come to the point where, as an individual, he was about to explode, just because of his deep-seated belief in the integrity of government. And Henry was head of the criminal division, and I think Nixon had appointed him late in the game. So Henry I can't believe that the man that appointed me would be doing these things.
Tell us about the...
But I have to explain to you, as a prosecutor, you make up your mind early on sometimes about the person that you're targeting or pursuing, but you make sure in your own mind that you have the evidence to prove it before you convince yourself to do something about it.
And when did you think you had that evidence?
With the tapes. And we were hoping that what was on the original tapes that were turned over would convince any judge to give us more.
Did it surprise you when you heard the Cancer on the Presidency or March 21st, 73 tape that the White House had actually turned this over to prosecutors?
Well, that Tuesday when the lawyer got up and told Sirica, we were all totally, we had no indication ahead of time that the president reversed his position.
We haven't had a chance to get a word picture from you of Judge Sirica. Tell us about your relationship with Judge Sirica and what kind of man he was, as you recall.
Well, I felt sorry for Judge Sirica because the Republicans generally in the media were really critical of Sirica. And the White House particularly had been very critical of him. And he responded favorably, I think, to any motions that we made. And the Republican establishment didn't understand why. And so they blacklisted him with everybody else working on it, claiming he was biased and he had made incorrect rulings. But Sirica was a determined individual. And the chief judge in the district at that time, in the district court, was Judge Hart, who was, if anything, a Republican advocate. And Hart criticized Sirica. And I think the judge was hurt by that. But I admired him for staying with the case in very difficult circumstances.
Did you ever interact with his clerk, D. Todd Christofferson?
Yeah, what was his name?
Todd Christofferson.
Yes. Have you talked to him?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Todd was there when we met with Sirica a couple of times, but Todd interacted more with Benveniste and the investigators, particularly during the tapes hearings after the gap was released, or not released.
What do you recall of Rosemary Wood's testimony on the gap?
Well, I think all of us had our physical versions of the Rosemary stretch, which she testified eliminated the 18 and a half minutes. So we'd all get in our chairs and, try to manipulate a tape recorder, and none of us believed her.
Over December and early January, the White House turns over a few more tapes.
Yeah. Yeah, we would send letters over specifying the dates and the times and the participants.
Did you and Mr. Jaworski ever figure out why the White House was giving you more tapes? Was it because it was hard enough to get the original, at least some of the original 9, but now you received another batch, but roughly 17 during that period.
Before the trial, you mean?
Yes, before the...
Well, we were badgering them constantly, and Sirica and the Circuit Court of Appeals had made the original ruling to turn over the original requested tapes. And I think the White House lawyers must have felt they should keep something turning over. We were always asking for a new set of documents. That was, in a way, more frustrating than the tapes because, some of our staff would have been nice to just go through the documents. And even when Ford was president, or at any time, we never had that opportunity. We'd have to ask for something, and then the president's lawyer would search for it and say he turned over anything relevant that he found. And we never got to do the actual searching, which prosecutors rarely do. If you subpoena business records from a business, you have to depend on them to produce what they have.
Would you like some more water?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Please tell us what you remember of the debate over whether or not to indict the president, or whether a president could be indicted.
Well, I think at one point I persuaded Leon to ask every member of the staff who had a view on that to submit to him, Leon, a legal memo on the issue. And a lot of people did. And I don't think there was anyone on the staff who thought there was a legal impediment to indicting a president. But everybody realized the problems that were present, obviously.
Well, what do you think Leon Jaworski's view was?
Well, honestly, I had been told that Leon wanted to get back to Texas no more than a year after coming to the office. And I think that probably influenced his stated legal judgment that a president could not be indicted. We had a lot of trouble convincing Leon to name Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Watergate cover-up indictment. And after that ongoing debate, I was not surprised that Leon thought that you could not indict a president.
So the unindicted co-conspirator was not a compromise. That was, but the discussion over whether President Nixon could be indicted continued after the
Yes.
February 1974 decision by the grand jury to name the president as an unindicted co-conspirator. That
Yes,
continued.
it continued until the day of the pardon.
Could you tell the people watching, please, why it was important that the president be, at the very least, be an unindicted co-conspirator for prosecutorial reasons?
Well, there are a lot of evidentiary reasons for naming a person as an unindicted co-conspirator. It means that any conversation that someone has with that person is in furtherance of the conspiracy. So that's the main legal reason for doing it.
Please tell us about the writing of the roadmap, the so-called roadmap. Who did it?
Well, originally, George Frampton, have you talked to him?
No.
George Frampton, one of the lawyers working with Benveniste, he and Benveniste on their own had decided that we should have a memo portraying the evidence as to Nixon's criminality. And I remember when this memo crossed my desk, it's like, what the hell is this? And because nobody had asked for it at that point. And I talked to Benveniste and Frampton, and they said they thought Leon ought to have this, and I said, well, now he does, but I don't want to read about this in Time magazine or Newsweek, because we were always concerned about leaks. And I must say, the office was very good about that. There were very few actual leaks, even though all of us had gotten to know the reporters. And so they had that memo, and there it was. And so when the House committee started impeachment proceedings, we had to figure a way that they could get access to our evidence. And the only way for them to do it was to turn over all the documents, or at least give them a summary of what's there, which I thought and argued to Leon that we had a duty to do that. If they're going to work on impeachment, why do it without the evidence? Make sure they do something that's accurate. And so I remember Leon, and I never figured out why, but he was really annoyed with Peter Rodino, the chairman of the House committee. So Leon at first, no, we can't do that. And I started talking with Doar, and we had John Doar come down to the office some nights and read some of the evidence. And finally, Leon agreed to this roadmap, which Benveniste and Frampton had put together. And we had to go to Judge Sirica for permission to turn it over because there was grand jury testimony in there. Sirica gave us permission. And so we turned it over.
Did you not have to wait a little bit because didn't Gordon Strawn and Bob Haldeman both try to prevent this information from being shared with the House Judiciary Committee?
Well, yeah, the White House generally tried to prevent it. And the White House lawyers said it was illegal for us to do that. And we didn't see how it was illegal if the judge approved it. We always intended to go to the judge first.
But I just want to be sure I understood. Mr. Doar did get to see some of your material before Judge Sirica's initial order.
I believe so.
Tell us about, you mentioned earlier that you knew Mr. Doar from, I guess, the time when he was working with the Bed-Stuy Foundation, or Bed-Stuy project.
No, I got to know him as a neighbor, really. And then in Mississippi. In Mississippi in '64, when Doar was coming down there, he called me and said, "I'd like you to ride around with me." And so I rode around Mississippi with him for about a week or two.
So tell us about, would you describe him as a friend of yours at the time?
Yes.
Did you find out from him that he had been selected as majority counsel for the House Judiciary Committee's staff inquiry?
I probably read it in the newspaper and called him.
Leon Jaworski later recalled that Mr. Doar was frustrated by the materials that had been turned over to him by the Senate, that it was very complex, complicated, very difficult to wade through them. Do you remember, did he ever talk to you about the difficulties that the committee was facing in making sense of all the materials that they were receiving?
Well, sure. And I tried to help him. I thought they were doing a substantive job and would have tremendous difficulty. it was pretty obvious that the Republican members of the staff and the Republican members of the committee were still totally supporting Nixon and didn't believe any of our evidence, or said they didn't. So I wanted to help John. And I remember he told me one time that John Doar's son when John was out one night, he called a member of our staff to babysit his son. And John said the staff member had told his son that night, "Tell your father to subpoena the March 21 tape." So everybody wanted to cooperate because they knew Doar would do a good job.
You must have told him, did you tell him in that early period how important the March 21st tape was, since it had been so important to Leon Jaworski, and Leon Jaworski had heard it in December of '73, so you were talking to John Doar subsequent to that. Did you let him know how important that tape would be for his investigation?
I'm sure I did, over this table.
The viewers can't see it, but the table here, tell us about the table here.
Well, John and I met for dinner at my house a number of times during that period, and we would sit at that table and eat and discuss Watergate.
Let me switch to this one.
Okay, thank you.